Welcome to Washington in Focus. I'm Carlene Johnson, the Center Square state government reporter. And joining me today to talk about his article is our investigative reporter, TJ Martinell. We've been talking a lot about Congress contemplating repealing California having stricter emissions standards than the federal Clean Air Act. And this is going to have some huge ramifications across the country for states like Washington because we're tied to California. This also impacts the trucking industry, but they're getting some criticism for not trying to go the route of cleaner trucks on the road. TJ, set the stage for us.
Yeah, so there's been ongoing dispute between, I'd say, I won't even say state officials, but people who are advocating for electric trucks and people who actually work in the trucking industry. So there's the Electric Vehicle Coordinating Council that's trying to figure out how to come up with recommendations to the state for ways to make this transition. And last year, they published a report to the legislature that blamed market failure for the increased prices in EV trucks that, quote, may require policy. And that was last year. I did a story on that. Well, recently, they had a meeting where someone with a nonprofit called the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management said that truck manufacturers are taking every single opportunity to undermine the success of the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation. And their argument is that they're doing this by requiring the sale of a zero-emission truck before they can buy a diesel truck. And he says that this is a questionable thing. Of course, I talk to people in the trucking industry and they go, yeah, because we don't want to get fined. Because
they don't really have any choice here in Washington.
Yeah, they want to make sure that they fulfilled their sales obligations and meet their quotas for EVs because there's no quota for diesel. So it really goes back to this issue of incentives. There's an incentive for them to now demand that zero emission trucks are sold first, making sure that they've met these requirements before they start selling diesel, because what they don't want to have is have the diesel trucks sold. Now you've got to sell so many EV trucks by the end of the month or by the end of the quarter, whatever the compliance timeline is. Well, if I'm a guy who's looking to buy trucks, I'm going to wait until the end of the month to go and then just completely lowball the EV trucks. I mean, they would end up having to sell them at such a low price that they'd have to jack up the cost of diesel trucks in order to offset that. So this would be another market manipulation where diesel trucks would cost more because they'd have to undersell the EV trucks in order to get them off the lot.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and at the same time, not only is there the cost of these EV trucks, as you've reported on, and I have as well, 2 and 3 times as expensive as a diesel vehicle. Then you've got the length that this thing can go before you got to stop down and charge for 5-6 hours at a charging station that in Washington doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, there's so many issues with this. And so it's just interesting to see that people are blaming, they're claiming that the industry itself is undermining these regulations. And that really, I think, begs the question of to what extent is the industry itself being involved in the decision-making process? Because this is like a general coming up with a battle plan, and the frontline troops who actually have to do the fighting say, this plan's not going to work. You're asking us to advance across this field. Totally. There's barbed wire, there's mines, there's mud that go up to our knees, and we're expected to rush across this field and take this assault this position. It's not practical. The general, it would be wise for him to say, I may not agree, but they're the ones who are actually on the ground over there. So I need to listen to what they have to say and take it into account when I make my decisions. You think that the state would be asking the trucking industry, is this something that you guys can actually do?
They've been loudly saying, whether they're asked to be at the table or not, as you know, they show up at all the legislative hearings and say, it ain't going to work. I mean, electrifying big rigs at lofty goal, great for the future, who wants diesel emissions, but it's nowhere near ready for the timelines that have been set, at least here in Washington state. And I think California is saying the same thing.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the state environmental policies, particularly around electric vehicles, is based on a desire or a hope or a dream rather than what's practically feasible. Because, as I've documented and you've documented as well in stories, for example, there's like you mentioned, the charging ports. There's not enough of them around the state. They'd have to build millions of them within the next 9 years, and they're nowhere near close to building it. It would cost a lot of money. And then you've got to deal with the fact that in some parts of the state, the electric vehicles don't do well during the winter because it gets too cold. So they got to be able to be safely stored, especially if you've got public sector fleets that are electric. And then you've got the issue of vandalism, where EV charging stations, unlike gas station, if a gas station is vandalized or they sabotage people's ability to use the gas, it's because there's probably a fire, and that's a big deal. And we would rightfully see it as an issue, an environmental issue and safety issue and concerns. But there's been so many vandalisms of EV charging ports that it could potentially, based on the existing number, it could shut down a whole region, at least for the public sector or publicly available charging ports. So people would really be at the mercy of being able to access private charging ports, and in areas where they also can't be. I mean, not that anybody would want to vandalize those because they're not going to get the copper the same way they do out charging stations. But these are all these things that are coming into play. And so you think that there would be a little bit more of it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of productivity in saying that this is a market failure, because you can't compel the market to do something. You can't force the market, for example, to make EV trucks more affordable. The cars didn't become affordable because the state or government mandated it. They got affordable because Henry Ford invented the assembly line and was able to expedite the process of building a car to where it was more affordable. So it's almost like some of them are just thinking, let's make this mandatory and let the market figure it out. Well, when the market doesn't figure it out, that becomes a bit of a problem.
Well, in the meantime, you're crushing business in the state of Washington. I remember the last time I wrote about this during the legislative session, I spoke to Steve Gordon with Gordon Truck Centers, and they're the ones that are required to. You're going to sell X number of EV trucks before you can sell any diesel. Well, basically, they've already lost a whole year of sales.
Yeah.
Because first of all, there isn't a market for it. There's no demand, right? Supply and demand. Excuse me. So if nobody wants these trucks at this point, no one's looking for them. So if he can't sell them, then he can't sell any of the diesel trucks on his lot. They're down like 80-90% year over year. So you're crushing the truck manufacturing business at the same time that you're also, hurting it on the other end. And yet it seems like, despite the direction that the federal government is going right now, the state of Washington isn't putting the brakes on this at all. I don't know. What's your sense of that?
Well, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how they respond, because one of the problems is, and this is particular with the trucking, unlike private. So there's the law that says by 2035, you can't register a new vehicle that isn't that's powered by gasoline or fossil fuels. That's an issue for somebody who lives in the state and has to register their vehicle in the state. But if you own a trucking company, you just move over to Idaho and you set 100%. Up shop there. And
it's already happening. Yeah.
All right. It's already happening. So this is where there's this weird sense that people won't respond to incentives. That it's a really weird kind of situation of it's like when we talked about the wealth tax and the idea that if you try to tax the ultra rich like that, they'll just pack up and leave. And people think, no, they wouldn't. Well, that's exactly what Jeff Bezos did. And moved to Florida. So this idea that people can't move and can't leave and can't move outside the scope of these regulations, and there's no incentive for them to stick around. For example, if you own a trucking, if you sell trucks, you're not moving to Washington State. But if you're operating in Washington State, you have a lot of incentives to move, especially since Idaho is right across the border, and Idaho's policies are very different from Washington State's in this regard. They're not on board with like Oregon and California when it comes to a lot of these environmental policies. So That's another incentive, is they're not moving to a state that could implement this in 5 years. They're moving to a state that's going in a completely politically going in a completely different direction, which provides some long-term certainty, which businesses need in order to operate.
And the independent truckers, and there's a huge industry of that right here in Washington. They're going, like you said, they're going to go buy trucks in Idaho and Montana and Nevada and states that aren't, beholden to all of these environmental regulations. They may well be operating that truck still in Washington. So is that real? Are we really meeting our climate goals as a result of all this? Could certainly make an argument that no, because you've still got the diesel powered vehicle, operating along the interstate as much as ever. Meantime, you've crushed the industry and destroyed business here in Washington because they can't sell those trucks here. It's fascinating. And I think given what's happening at the federal level and, them coming down in California saying you can't go further and us being tied to California here in Washington, it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out. I imagine that, this next legislative session in early 2026, it's going to be a huge discussion. And the trucking industry folks were there in mass on several times during session.
I think the difference is that the one big key distinction is that the next time around, Washington state elected officials are going to have to own up to this, because what they did before is they said, oh, we're going to hand over regulatory authority to an out-of-state bureaucracy, and we're not the ones actually setting the policy. Now they got to be the ones to say, we're the ones setting the policy. So they're going to have to take responsibility for whatever policies they set. And so when people are seeing, when there's maybe a supply chain issue with trucks and there's not enough trucks coming around, or there's disruptions in the market, and the trucking industry can say, because of these regulations, well, who's responsible for those regulations? It's not the California Air Quality Control Board. It's Washington.
We're going to have to own it. You're right, because they got to figure out which direction they're going to go. And based on this ruling, at least, they can't go further than federal regulations for emissions standards. So it's fascinating. Things turn fast and furious with the current Trump administration. And then you never know if some judge is going to come back and undo, all of that. So I appreciate you being all over this. And we're going to continue to follow this issue closely at thecentersquare.com, along with TJ Martinell. For Washington in Focus, I'm Carlene Johnson.